Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the second MERA powered by Griff webinar. Today, we are going to focus on legal and HR issues that you might be facing at the moment. So I'm delighted that we have an expert panel for you to ask questions to. We have compiled questions which were sent through in advance, so thank you very much everyone who emailed me through questions. Simon has those, and he will be taking the panelists through those, and we'll get through as many as we can. Please do also feel free to use the Q&A down the bottom, and that way Simon will be able to see any questions that you have in real time, and the panelists will try to get to them. As we did last week, any questions we're not able to answer, we will send through to the panelists, and they'll be kind enough to provide some responses after the event, and we will circulate that. And thank you everybody who has filled out the survey that we sent through, and that's live until Thursday. I'll be back at the end to wrap up and tell you what we have in store for you next week, but now I will hand over to Simon.
Thank you, Jennifer. Yes, thank you all for joining us once again. I'm sure many of you were here last week for the opening session, where a number of MERA's founding board members explained the role of the organisation or what they hope to achieve in today's F&B industry. And we had a very engaging Q&A with the questions absolutely flying in. So hopefully we'll have more of the same today as we hold MERA's first legal and HR clinic with 3 highly knowledgeable experts here to answer your questions and to give you some priceless advice. As Jennifer said, we've already had a number of questions come through, focused on everything from rent, employment, government initiatives, insurance, everything. We'll work our way through as many as we can in the next hour. And as always, as Jennifer mentioned, we invite you to please send in your questions below via the Q&A tab that you can see on your screen. Everything you go there can be seen by myself, and then we can put that to the panel as well. So please, as many questions as you can. There's also the chat panel, which you can also chat to panelists or amongst yourself. So please make use of these and try and make this as interactive as possible. Now, I think we have so many questions to go through, so let's dive right into them. And we'll start with one of the biggest issues that everyone is facing right now, which is rent. So these are some of the questions that we've already had sent through. So the first one that we saw was, we've seen that in the past few weeks, larger mall landlords have waived rents for up to 3 months for some of their occupants. What about the smaller independent landlords with people struggling at the moment? How can we get them on board and also kind of waiving rent or helping out restaurants in this time?
Shall I take that on, Simon?
Please, Joe.
So I think it's good to look at what's been offered at the moment. Like you said, there's quite a few of the big landlords that have made some announcements. You've got Aldar, you've got Nikhil, MERA, Dubai Holding, all the major players of Dubai Inc. offering sort of stimulus packages of in the millions. It's good to look at the details of what they're actually offering, and then that gives you some ammunition to go to the smaller landlords. So I mean, if you look at some examples, some are offering rent-free periods. So Nikhil, and they're offering to waive admin fees for 3 months. You're looking at reductions in DERA by 10%, although that was a government mandated issue across the board. DIFC are offering to defer up to 3 months rent for a period of up to 6 months time. That not many have come out and offered absolute rent-free periods. And I know that's something Naim was sort of suggesting on last week's call. He said, we don't want to be burdened with repaying this additional rent. What we actually want is that rent being wiped off for X amount of months while the crisis is continuing. But I think it's got to, what they're willing to do, the bigger landlords, I think that's the sort of what we look as a benchmark and see what they've been offering in the market and suggest that to the smaller ones. So also around the world as well, we don't just have to look at what's in the UAE. I think today the Australian government came out with a plan, and they were sort of saying, you need to sit down, you need to do an agreement with your landlords. Let's look at a mix of some rent abatement altogether and rent reductions. And they were looking at deferring payment terms up to 24 months or the rest of the contract. So I think coming back to the initial question, it depends on what your individual situation is. I think you as the F&B entity that's being impacted, they need to look at what their cash flow is, what they realistically can pay, when they can repay that. It may be that they're sort of more subject to the highs and lows of the market. So you don't want to be making additional payments during Ramadan in the summer months, but you may be able to offer your landlord, some higher payments in the boom time. So I think really you've got to take that time, sit down, assess, and then come up with what you are actually looking for in terms of the relationship between you and your landlord.
I mean, I'm not surprised that Naeem would try his luck to get his rent completely waived. But for most operators who are trying to approach these landlords, you mentioned there, looking at what the big boys are offering and suggesting that to your landlord. Do you have any other tips or any other bits of advice for that negotiation that they take into them with their landlord?
Well, I think you do go in hard, as Naeem said. You go in with the ideal position. So that is, probably for most a rent abatement for a number of months. But then you need your fallback position. So would you consider, again, a mix of no rent for a few months and then repayment over a certain time? I did see one. I think it was DIFC suggested. No, it was the Dubai Free Zones Council said, well, what we'll do, we'll actually give you your security deposits back. And that was quite an innovative idea. So then, you've got that releases that cash. I don't know the details of that when it has to be returned again, but innovative things like that to create, a cash flow immediately. Anything that you can think of that will help relieve those, the day-to-day cash burden. And it's all about sort of building a compelling case for the landlord. So, you go. It's better to start the conversation early. You go with open arms. You say, this is the situation. My rent's down. The ministry said we can't obviously have dine-in. Our business has fallen by X. We can afford to pay Y. And paint the picture of what happens if they don't partner with you. If they don't sort of willing to come to the table, the risk is they lose you as a tenant, and they're unlikely to be able to find another tenant to replace in this market. Is the reality.
Yeah, sure. So you think landlords might be more amenable if you come with certain ideas and with some suggestions?
Yeah, exactly. Give them ideas, and ideally ones that work specifically for you and your unique situation.
And one of the questions we had was, what if it is kind of worst case scenario? You get to the point where you have post-dated checks, but your cash flow, due to the loss of revenue in March and now April, you simply can't fulfill them, and your developer and the landlords are not being supportive. What do you do then?
I mean, bounce checks is still a tricky one in the UAE. It is still a criminal offence. I mean, they did change the law a few years ago to so that any bounce checks under 200,000 dirhams, you were going to get a fine rather than prison time. But it still is, embarrassing to get hauled down to the police station if it's your name as the director on that check. So number one advice is avoid bouncing checks if you can. Number two is open that discussion with the landlords. Don't wait until it bounces. Call the landlord up, have that discussion, first. And again, look at some ways of deferring those payments, either long term or short term.
I noticed the first question we've had in, Damien Conway has asked, are commercial evictions banned for 3 months? Anything he's heard?
There was some talk of that. I think there was. When did I see that? That was in something recently that said that there wouldn't be any fines. Fines would be waived, and evictions would be put on hold. That was one of the Dubai government initiatives. I can't remember exactly where I saw that, but yeah, I mean, in this current situation, one, it's going to be hard to actually take any matters to the rent committee. A lot of the courts are actually shut, so practically the whole, the process of getting powers of attorney, starting court cases is tricky at the moment. They are online, but that's tricky, and you're going to get a realistic, I think, response from the rent committee. That they're going to look at the situation and come up with hopefully some fair decisions in this market.
If we can I noticed quite a lot of questions coming into the chat. If you can try and, guys, people watching, if you can put them into the Q&A section so we can keep track of them better, that would be very helpful. Thank you. Yeah, I know someone has asked, why should we pay rent when we're closed? But well, I guess we don't really have much of an option, is the answer there. Yeah, I mean, rent cost in the UAE has been certainly a hot topic. Not just now, it's been a hot topic for years. And as I said, one of the questions we had in before said it's been a threat to the industry stability. Although we're talking about what we can do right now to handle what's happening because of the coronavirus pandemic, what initiatives can be taken to tackle this long term?
Well, I think long term, we already were seeing a sort of a change in the leasing market, commercial and residential, because of the situation. There was the downturn in the region before COVID happened. So I think this plus COVID is going to have an impact, and the landlords are going to have to be more realistic on their rents. There may be more of a change of, because often some of these leases have a base, rental fee, and then a fee that's subject to the revenue. So maybe it might be fairer to look at a bigger portion to be on revenue. And a lot of the tenants didn't like it. They didn't say, why, if I'm paying you rent, why should you get a percentage of my the upside as well? But if that fluctuates and it also goes down in the downturn, then that might be something that actually could benefit tenants, whereas it couldn't before. So we may see some innovations in the drafting of the leases. People are obviously going to be more concerned about these sort of impacts and look more carefully at the force majeure clauses and other sort of postponement or termination clauses as well.
Yeah, well, I know I had lots of people come to me last year complaining about the turnover rent model, but right now it would be beneficial. I know since you brought up force majeure there, and we've already had a question about it. Basically people are asking, is it relevant? Is it something that we can apply during COVID-19? Yeah,
I mean, force majeure is probably a topic on its own that you could talk for an hour about, but it is relevant. I mean, we've heard the phrase bandied around a lot recently since COVID. It applies. It's the same test that applies for anything for force majeure. Firstly, you have to take the contract and look at the governing law in the courts. So, in the UAE, their approach to force majeure, there's actually a code in the civil code which deals with force majeure. So, if in UAE, that's going to be totally different than if it's an English law contract, which we still do get some of here in Dubai. Some of the commercial agreements are subject to English law, like the F&B franchises are often English law. So yeah, step one is, what's the law? What's the courts? Is it arbitration? Is it local courts? So there's different tests that apply to those different civil or common law jurisdictions. Next, you have to look at what is the event. So is COVID a force majeure event? Now, the first place to look to is to the contract. So will it have a long definition of what a force majeure is? Some have a real exhaustive list, and ideally if that includes global pandemic, it clearly falls within it. The likelihood is that it probably doesn't. But a lot of force majeure clauses have that sort of general sweeper words, that say, or anything else that's outside of the control of the parties, if it was an unforeseeable act. So really, it depends on your unique contract. And unfortunately, if we're talking about leases, there's no sort of standard form lease in Dubai. Each big landlord imposes its own terms, and it's always drafted obviously in their favour. So they're unlikely to be very generous in their drafting towards the tenants. But different commercial contracts have different force majeure clauses. So yeah, you've got to assess whether COVID was it outside of the control of the parties? Yes, I think you'd struggle to argue that you could control that. Even sort of the spread within, master communities, it's very hard to even try and argue that a regional developer could control their own areas. Was it unforeseeable? And that's going to be, I think, an interesting one, because, we have been hit with global pandemics before in the past. Everyone's talking about the last big one being the Spanish flu in the 1918 or whatever it was. But more recently, we've had, SARS, we've had Ebola, we've had, bird flu. So that's going to be, I think, one area where there's going to be big sort of debate. So that, was it foreseeable? You've got people like, the TED Talk, Bill Gates back in 2015, predicted this, warned the world that there was going to be another flu epidemic coming soon, so all that gives you arguments either way of whether it was foreseeable or not. And then, so if you pass that, so if the test is, if it is unforeseeable, if it is outside of the control of the parties, the next test is, did that actual event prevent or make the contract impossible. So that's quite a high hurdle. So it's not whether, you know, that's going to cause you a pain in your pocket in terms of you're going to lose some money. This is your obligation now impossible because of COVID-19? And even that's going to be dependent on each unique restaurant, right? So, you know, restaurants can, okay, they're restricted from doing dine-in, but they can do, you know, delivery takeaway. So some of the fast food restaurants may have been set up better to you know, benefit from that anyway, whereas the fine dining, you know, restaurants, you know, can they turn their business quickly into a delivery? Does it even work for delivery? And we had some comments on that last week, didn't we, about, you know, some of the finer dining restaurants trying to club together, having central kitchens and come out with different sort of delivery options. So yeah, again, the test is unique for each even restaurant as well. And then, so yeah, I mean, that's basically the three-pronged test. You know, what's the governing law? Is it unforeseeable, outside of control, and did it actually prevent the obligation? So it's quite a complex test. There's no definite yes, no. COVID does apply. It's definitely worth a go. But having said that, you've got to understand the implications of it, because there's one thing arguing, you know, putting your arms up saying, sorry, I can't pay my rent, it's force majeure, but that can actually have an impact. So you need to look at where else in the contract that kicks in. So if it is a force majeure, there's normally obligations on both sides. So what you have to do is both parties have to use all reasonable endeavours to mitigate the loss that's going on. So that's an actual obligation on you, right? And then also potentially either party can terminate. So you may have a, you know, unique site in Dubai Mall, you know, a key location that you don't actually want to lose. You don't want to give the landlord the right to terminate. All you want is a rent abatement for a couple of months. So in those situations, you've got to be very careful of you know, swinging around the banner of force majeure in case it backfires on you and you're out of a key location as well. So there's lots of considerations, basically.
Yeah, so it's a too complex issue for her completely covered here today, and as you said, for each individual restaurant chain it will be completely different. So I guess the recommendation would be they should all get their own legal advice based on their situation.
Correct, yeah.
Also regarding insurance, someone asked, is all risk insurance of any use in the pandemic?
It can be. So I'm answering all these questions. If anyone else wants to jump in, please.
Sorry, yeah, we'll move on from this.
I'm just checking. I don't want to hug the limelight. I know we'll move on to the employment, and we've got our gurus on for that in a minute. The insurance. I mean, there's lots of insurance options being bandied around at the moment. I mean, there's, you know, at least 10 different types of insurance. There's business continuity is probably more likely one to kick in, I'd say, than all risks maybe. So, you know, the business continuity, a lot of the hotels have to have that as part of the hotel management agreements. A lot of the franchise restaurants have that. So if you do have business continuity, it's worth digging out those policies and seeing what events they cover. Historically, they normally cover some sort of physical damage to the restaurant. So, you know, a fire in the kitchen, and that stops you earning revenue. That's your typical scenario of business continuity. But it can include government intervention as well. So, you know, if you do have that insurance policy, and some people may not even know that what insurance they have in place, the first thing is, you know, speak to your insurance broker, dig out your insurance policies and assess it. The all risks insurance could potentially cover it. It depends if it's excluded. So the way all risks insurance works, I think, I'm not an insurance expert, but it covers everything unless it's excluded. And there is normally a long list of exclusions, you know, like earthquakes, war, government seizure. So again, it's going to depend on each particular policy. You're going to have to dig that out and look at the exact policy wording.
And now, just before we head on to employment, we had another question come in regarding rent, and Andy Holman asks, from a practical perspective, how are RDC and the courts operating during the lockdown period?
I think we personally, the bench, don't actually do litigation work. We team up with local advocates to do that local work. But it's, you know, what I've heard from them that we're working with, there is delays. They have gone to an online model. But that is causing issues, like I said, with powers of attorneys and things like that getting notarized, authenticated. Some of that has now moved to an online system as well, so you can get POAs notarized. But this is all brand new. It's all new. It's all coming, you know, last minute of trying to deal with these issues. So you will expect delays in all the courts in the UAE.
Well, thanks, Joby, for 20 minutes there of great legal advice. But we'll try and open it up a little bit more. So we have two other fantastic experts on with us. Now, in terms of employment, one of the questions we had in prior to today's session, basically saying that a lot of companies are looking to cut payroll to a certain percentage. Have you found that this is across the board, or is it by salary bracket?
Do you want me to take this one, Caron, or from your perspective, is it more of your sort of day-to-day practical from the HR perspective? Certainly, I'm finding from the perspective of most of the clients that I've been dealing with, it's a variable, a very varied picture. Some employers are looking at going to an unpaid leave scenario at the moment, where essentially there's no salary going in. Some are looking at a reduction of, say, 30%, some at, say, 50%. Some of them are applying to part of the remuneration whilst still preserving the allowances and so forth. So at the moment, there's a huge variation across the board, really, of what I'm seeing. So there's no sort of one-size-fits-all sort of approach being adopted. The biggest issue that I've seen actually is from some of those clients who are obviously involved in Expo, and whilst not obviously identifying anybody as such, but particular sectors are getting hit hard at this stage. The uncertainty around Expo, a lot of the early delivery obligations that they have, obviously, particularly against the timetable that they originally had as well. That's causing obviously quite a lot of concern, and the workforce that they've taken on for that purpose is now sitting twiddling his thumbs, wondering what's going to happen next. We know that obviously, I mean, just staying on Expo just for a moment, we know that obviously we're looking at a postponement there to next year. What happens in the interim? For how long can you sustain people during that period? The other issue that we do have with the Resolution 279, which is the fundamental issue, which the fundamental resolution, which obviously deals with the issue of how far you can actually reduce salary, be it temporarily or permanently, is that there's still a little bit of a lack of clarity as to where it applies. As far as the resolution itself is concerned, it identifies that it applies to all. It applies to all businesses that fall under the ministry's jurisdiction. My understanding, though, is that DMCC and DDA, TCOM as was, so I'm just trying to get rid of a rather annoying fly that's buzzing around my face while I'm talking to you. They have actually stated that they're going to be adopting the same measures. Now, that's fine up to a point, but what we don't know is what happens then with some of those other measures further down the line. For example, the preservation of housing allowance going into the virtual labour market and so on. So there's a few sort of broader questions that flow from your question there as to how it's going to impact upon a whole variety of different employers.
Has that been your experience, Caron?
It has. I think it's looking at what the businesses want to do to support their team members versus what they need to support the business in the long run, and looking at gradual cuts has been the main process. So obviously people can't go anywhere. So the other thing is that they would be happy to send their team members home for the time being, but they're stuck. There's nowhere to go to. So trying to find the best solution. There is no one answer fits all. It's what fits for the business first, and then how do you roll that out to your team members to protect both parties?
Yeah. And related to wage costs, we've just had a question in from Emmanuel Clave, who says that obviously wage cost is a challenge and there's not much in the way of government help at the moment. So to ensure that once it is back to business as usual and we still have a workforce in place, are there any discussions or plans ongoing to help ensure that does happen, and the restaurants still do have a workforce here when things get back to normal?
Certainly, in terms of planning ahead, there's a huge amount of uncertainty as to when businesses think that they're going to, and certainly one of my restaurant clients has actually asked me, has basically said to me, in terms of how long it's going to take for us to get back on our feet and be in a position where we could actually return to any sort of normality in terms of salary. At this stage, it's, to use that awful expression, it's how long's a piece of string, really. They really don't know. So, for example, those outlets that are in areas where there's a high tourist footfall. So, for example, in Dubai Mall, there are obviously food outlets there that have closed down at the moment, like everything else has. A lot of their custom comes from tourism. Well, that's obviously been hammered, inevitably. They are then asking the question, well, as and when we do open up again, inevitably we're probably going to end up with a headcount reduction, which is imminent in any event at the moment for this particular couple of these particular clients of mine. And then looking further down the line, we know that we won't be able to preserve salaries at the level they were at before. And that's where, if you look at Ministerial Resolution 279, obviously the one that just came out, that obviously becomes quite an acute concern for people as to which of the routes they go down under 279. Do they go down the route of imposing a temporary reduction in salary, or do they go down the route of making a decision now that they impose a permanent reduction of salary, which will require, in both cases, it requires agreement, and perhaps that's something we'll touch on in a moment about how some employers are perhaps being a little bit naughty about the agreement side of things. But certainly the agreement to permanent reduction is something that also requires ministry approval. That's one of the complicating factors, by the way, going back to the point I made a moment ago regarding, let's say, DMCC and DDA. There's nothing, given that it says it requires ministry approval, will DMCC and DDA, TCOM as was, set out their own regulations which say you will require the TCOM, or the DDA rather, authority, or the DMCC authorities approval of any permanent changes, which will be set out in the appendix to the contract. So there's a raft of concerns there for employers as to what hurdles they have to jump over as well to effect these changes. Given that we're in a situation as well where these are pretty critical decisions now. Businesses' survival depends upon these. If you have staff who aren't going to actually agree to temporary or permanent reductions, then what are you left with as your option?
Yes, well, I see we have Chris Martin has put in the question saying that he has an online delivery platform, but even with the current situation, delivery is still down due to people cooking at home and trying to save money. Obviously, a lot of people facing wage reductions. And he's asking, in terms of termination versus asking employees to resign, are restaurants on the hook for gratuity, and can employees be put on 3 months unpaid leave?
Do you want me to take that one, Caron? Yeah. Right. First of all, are they on the hook for gratuity? Well, if you're asking your staff to resign, then in reality you're actually putting them into a dismissal situation in truth, because you are asking them to make that decision. So essentially, it is actually a dismissal to all intents and purposes. In terms of gratuity, I don't think that one would be able to argue that any potential reduction to gratuity based upon the employee being the one resigning as opposed to the employer giving notice would wash in those circumstances, because again the labour courts would look back and say, well, what was the trigger for the resignation? And basically it was the employer telling you you've got to resign. As far as gratuity, you're stuck with irrespective, unless of course the employee hasn't got the requisite service, hasn't got the 1 year's continuous employment. And as regards 3 months, I think you said that the question was relating to people being unpaid for 3 months. Is that correct?
Can they be put on 3 months unpaid?
Well, again, I suppose the answer's in the question a little bit, to the extent of can they be put on it. Bottom line is no, strictly speaking, according to Resolution 279, it's got to be with agreement. That also has to be, it's one of two options there. First, that it's a temporary change, a temporary reduction. I mean, when we say reduction, of course, we're talking zero pay, but it's the reduction as defined. So that has to be with agreement, and that would have to be identified in a temporary appendix to the original employment contract. If, of course, we're looking at a permanent reduction beyond that 3 months, then we go to the point of needing ministry approval of it, or, as I mentioned before, DMCC or DDA. They're the two that I know, and actually 2454 up in Dubai, up in Abu Dhabi, sorry. They're also adopting the same approach. So again, these need to all be evidenced by agreement. And in the latter case, as I say, with a more permanent change, it's probably going to need the relevant authority or ministry's approval as well.
As you mentioned previously, we're in the unique situation right now where if employees lose their job, they also can't go back home as there are no flights operating. What measures, one of the questions we had previously was what measures are different operators taking to make sure that at the very minimum employees' food and shelter is taken care of?
Certainly what I'm seeing from clients as far as they can afford it, and this again is another big question actually, is adopting again one of the other provisions of the resolution. Of Resolution 279, I think it's under Article 3, the provision that if you've got surplus employees, for example, as they describe it, which is perhaps a tacit recognition at long last that there is actually such a thing as a redundancy dismissal. I actually differ from a number of commentators on this as regards whether that can or can't be a valid reason for termination. Yes, of course it can, is my view. But that's perhaps another discussion. As regards what people are doing on that front, that Article 3, which refers to placing people who are surplus employees into a virtual labour market, of course that presupposes that there are any jobs going to be out there for people to fill. And reality is there's going to be more people going on to the sort of theoretical unemployed list than there are actually taking up roles. In terms of what they're then doing to preserve their ability to survive, shall we say, the provision in Article 279, in Article 3 of Resolution 279, is to the effect that housing must be preserved. Now, we had a discussion about this, and a number of my colleagues and former colleagues have had this discussion as to what is actually meant by provision of housing. And Caron and I spoke about this earlier as well. And provision of housing, on the face of it, would appear to simply mean the provision of accommodation which is already supplied by the employer. But my view on that is that you have to give that a purposive approach, given what the intention of the resolution is. And the intention of the resolution was to preserve the interests of both parties as far as possible. I'm not entirely sure how one can do that effectively in the current climate, but at least it's a laudable sentiment, and to create some degree of stability in the marketplace. What that means, if you approach it from a purposive angle, is that realistically, anyone who is providing as part of the package something which is identified as housing allowance should continue to pay that. Now, at the risk of being slightly cynical about it, we all know that allowances as set out in contracts are a slightly artificial concept anyway, because ultimately they're simply put there as a means of reducing end of service gratuity liability. It's a means of splitting the remuneration to ensure you've got a basic salary aspect and an allowance aspect, because of course gratuity only applies to the basic salary part. At this stage, given that there is no ability to travel to work really, except in certain specific sectors, those areas where people are now at sort of stay at home or lockdown mode, an employer may well be looking at saying, well, that part of your salary or your remuneration that applies to travel or transport allowance is also suspended during this period. I don't think there'd be any great difficulties if somebody decided to go to court and have an argument about that. I don't think there'd be any great difficulties for the employer in making a pretty compelling case that that was an entirely appropriate step to take, because clearly if people aren't going to be travelling, it doesn't matter whether it's force majeure or not, we can forget about that from an employment context. It would be justifiable to reduce it by that amount. But going back, I suppose, full circle to the first question you asked, there's no sort of hard and fast benchmark as to what people are doing currently. I've got a full range, a full spectrum of people, from those who are saying we literally are going to go under, we cannot afford to pay any of this, and what risks can we effectively take and hope that we don't get in trouble in court over it, to those who are saying, yeah, we've got enough cash in the bank, we've got enough of a cash flow or cash surplus, shall we say, to be able to carry this for several months. But it will have to be at a reduction to the extent of a reduction of, say, 50% or 30% or whatever it might be.
I want to say, Caron, in terms of the employees coming to you, what are the concerns you're hearing from them at this time?
I think the key thing is exactly that. If I'm going to be made redundant, what money will I get? What if there is no money? How do I get home? If I don't go home, will the company keep my visa until I get another job? What will the company do? I'm happy to wait until the company has money, but I need help for food and accommodation, for example. So the key thing, my approach to most of my clients is a bit like a pre-opening, gradual stages of, I can afford to pay this amount of people, so I'll spread it across and give some money better than none. If there is no money whatsoever coming in, and it's then some of my companies are literally sending food, shopping out of their own pocket. They're, doing a Carrefour online and sending it to their employees just to minimise their cost of living costs. So there's no one answer fits all. The employee's greatest concern is A, I want to go home, and B, I can't go home. So there are flights going to some international airports in India. I hear Fly Dubai is going to start opening from the 15th. But even then, once they get to Mumbai or Delhi, but they can't then get onto their hometown, for example. So yeah, I wish there was some simple answers to that question, Simon. It's everybody has a different take on it in regards to, I think the biggest thing is, can my visa be maintained until I get another job? And ostensibly with WPS, you can, not pay your employee, keep them on your visa. DDA, DMCC, DIFC have like a 1 month limit before you have to cancel a visa. So I think that will also be a question ongoing for the authorities.
Just to jump in on that, Simon, if I may, just as a natural follow-on from what Caron said there, it's one of the questions, again, going back to the legislation, to the resolution, which has been, I suppose, slightly vexing in the sense that it raises more questions than it answers, because that Article 3 that we mentioned earlier regarding continuing to pay people, continuing your obligations in terms of their entitlements during that given period. Now, that period after they're identified as surplus employees, that particular period is supposed to be until such time as they find another role, for example, in the UAE, or leave the country, or, of course, the ending of the resolution. Now, the resolution itself, all of these are regarded as temporary precautionary measures. And so therefore it has a finite lifespan. As soon as it gets to a stage where the government feels that there's no longer a need for this resolution to be in place, then great, everything falls away and we revert to some sense of normality or a new normal. That's all fine, but what is really unclear, and this is a point that flows from what Caron said regarding the uncertainty around visas and so forth, is first and foremost whether you actually formally terminate in the sense that you would then go through a normal visa cancellation process. Now, I don't see how you can actually go through a formal visa cancellation process if you've got to then continue to be on record somehow, still providing accommodation or other allowances, because you must remain in some sort of sponsorship role at that point. This is something we're trying to get some clarity on at the moment, actually, from the ministry, because there's no clear identification of how this is going to work in a practical sense. It's self-evident that you can't have people out on the streets, roaming the streets after they've been terminated from a particular employment. And that would make, and therefore there'd be some sense there to say, well, this is why this is in place, so that visa cancellation doesn't take place immediately, the clock doesn't start ticking immediately. And therefore, going back to the purpose of Resolution 279, this would seem to be in accordance with that, namely to try to respect the relative interests of the parties. That said, the other flip side of that is this seems to be, the resolution seems to be a tacit recognition that the concept of redundancy is actually recognised, shall we say, within the labour law and within the marketplace now. If so, is this actually a case of you've been able to say, well, we still terminate irrespective, we still go through that visa cancellation process, and it simply means that overstays and so forth are put on hold. Now, my understanding is that there won't be fines for overstays in these current circumstances. But what's unclear is at what point that policy, in inverted commas, if you can call it that at this stage, will actually come to an end. Will it be at a stage where the government says, we're happy that there are enough flights going out now that, frankly, you should be able to crack on with this, and everybody who should be getting on a plane and going? That at the moment is so uncertain. And certainly when I was looking yesterday and said, oh, Emirates resuming flights to certain places, you initially think, well, wow, that's interesting. That's a huge development. Then you look more closely at the article, and it's actually talking about, again, emergency type flights just to repatriate people who are out of their normal country, i.e. not people who are necessarily resident in the UAE per se. Whether that then applies to those who have lost their job, then of course that's another matter.
Very interesting. Now, finally for Caron and John, in terms of, as I said, in terms of those most affected by this, the foot soldiers of hospitality, your cooks, your chefs, your waiters, your kitchen assistants, is there any legal entities or any charities set up or to exist that can help them at the moment, or is there any government plans getting made to support them through this time?
So at this moment in time, no clear direction, no clear support has been made available. It's been very much reliant on owner, sponsor, stroke, business owner plans. The key thing now, I know, if you've got live-in accommodation, it's easier, but those people who provide their own accommodation and their own access and means to get around, they're the ones who will struggle the most now. Sadly, there is nothing formal at this moment in time.
I think that I think this is, sorry Simon, I was just going to say, just to very briefly follow on from that, this is part of the issue, of course, in that we're in a society here where there is no social welfare system that would apply in terms of beyond obviously the UAE nationals. So for the vast majority of businesses that are obviously very heavily private businesses that are heavily expat staffed, it's incredibly difficult. The Dubai economy has grown on the basis and has always survived on the basis of the money that's come in from outside, the investment that's come in from outside, which has then developed obviously the marketplace more generally within the UAE. And so everything ultimately comes back to the market. There's nothing there which is going to be able to rely upon, for example, state. And given obviously the rules around charities and so forth as well, it's extremely unlikely that anything's going to crop up in the short term, which is actually going to provide any benefit for people. I did see a report, I'm sure that you would have seen it as well. I think it was the day before yesterday, identifying that KSA was looking at investing a huge amount of money into the private sector. What was unclear there was whether that investment was to assist employees or just simply to give businesses some other routes to survive during the current crisis. One would assume that the large amount they were talking about, I think it was 2.4 billion, I think they were talking about, $2.4 billion, that going into the market presumably is going to be identified as being for given purposes, namely, one would expect anyway, an element of that would be towards maintaining one's employees for a given period, but I've got no further details on that. And certainly I'm not seeing that there's anything in the UAE at the moment which is looking to reflect that currently.
Thanks, John. And Joby's been waiting patiently, so I noticed we said his name 3 times earlier, so Naeem has appeared with a question for Joby. And he just says, how about Chapter 11, liquidation and bankruptcy application?
First name to ask a hard one. I should know. I haven't heard of anything. I mean, there was a new insolvency law that came in end of 2019, beginning of this year, which put a new regime in place. I haven't heard of anything affecting that for COVID. Again, elsewhere around the world, Australia looking to sort of bring in a new change to their insolvency laws to make it harder for companies to get put into forced insolvency. If they've got cash flow issues, to give some protection for the businesses. So we might see that happen in the UAE. In the last sort of recession, the global recession, what happened in the UAE was specific tribunals were put in place to do sort of restructuring of big entities like Dubai World and, those types. So we may see some tribunals set up in the UAE, could happen. If that was Name's question, or the other thing was whether they're ongoing. The insolvency courts will be the same. The same issue that a lot of them are shut down, a lot of them are postponed. So I can't see any insolvency claims going that fast through the system either at the moment.
Thank you. We had Will Odwarka has asked, how successful do you think a joint approach or class action of tenants to the courts for a general solution on rent payments in the UAE would be? That it's a nationwide issue, and we think that may be a better way to get it.
Yeah, I think we've already seen that. We saw that in a slowdown in the market. Recently before COVID, we saw groups of tenants getting together and approaching not necessarily the courts, but approaching the landlords as a mass. Have a common voice, common concern. So certain developments that weren't sort of seeing the footfall that they were expecting, and that does help. So if all the tenants club together, they've got common concerns, and they go and speak to the landlord, he's going to take it, he or she's going to take it more seriously. I think he also he suggested that MERA could be a voice in that, and it's it's a great idea. There's sort of associations like MERA, or there's Hammer, the hotels asset management one. Any sort of association voice that can speak on behalf of all the tenants. I think it's a great idea. And if that can be raised at rent committee, if you could have some sort of document, impacting, just basically say this is the impact on tenants because of it, I think they're gonna look at it along with any other evidence.
Had a couple of people raise this question in the chat about what is the implied difference between contracts in Dubai that are governed by labour versus immigration in the current regulatory environment, with regards to termination, resignation,
So it's more of a John question, but those companies that are directly with immigration are not particularly governed by the labour courts. However, it is strongly recommended that they support and apply all principles. But I think the recourse, John, if I'm right, is limited, if I understand properly.
Yeah, I mean, ironically, literally, as you asked the question, Simon, I saw that come in. I just typed a quick answer on that, actually. And the approach, I think, is, as Caron says, again, I think irrespective of whether it's immigration or any other type of employer, the purposive approach there that's required, I think, to give effect to what the resolution. Remember, the resolution fundamentally it's a federal document, and is setting out a specific purpose that it wants and it actually goes on to say in the preamble to it that it basically makes a comment that it is a public policy decision, and therefore, as it's a public policy decision, one would expect, as Caron says there, that this ought to be applied irrespective of whether it's the likes of, well, we won't mention any names, but the labour supply type companies that provide staff through that, should we say, that immigration portal in inverted commas, then they should still adopt the same standards. But yes, in terms of what your ultimate recourse is, I'll be honest with you, I'm not clear at the moment how they are going to apply it, just simply because we are in such completely uncertain times. So I'm afraid that's a slightly vague answer, probably, but that's because there is no clear answer on it.
Now I have quite a broad question, but I guess quite a very important one. We came in prior to this session. As an SME, what has the government done so far to assist that I should be aware of? So, what information is out there, or what can people take advantage of?
I'll take that one, Simon. There's quite a lot out there. I mean, like we talked earlier about the landlords, and some of those are sort of government owned. So some of the initiatives have been through the free zones, DIFC, and the other guys have offered things in their role as landlord. There's been a lot of reduction of fees, some quite random, sort of like the trademark fees have just gone down 25%, which isn't going to directly benefit, but it's every little helps. And there's, reduction of fees in terms of customs duties. They've reduced their customs clearance fees. They're bringing stuff into the countries to be cheaper. Some exemptions from berthing fees. The DERA one, we mentioned the 10% reduction in, water and electricity bills. Some of the municipality fees have gone down. But the UAE, even the UAE is very complex because each Emirate's going to have its own approach. Different free zones have their own approach. So it's always a complex situation in UAE, let alone, looking across the wider GCC and Middle East that we're covering as a MERA association. The tax is the other one. I know sort of coming on to that, but the one big one could be sort of VAT tax relief, and that's what everyone's hoping for. And other countries again have looked at that, at baiting tax, or we've seen some action in the GCC, but it's mainly been deferral of the VAT submissions and deferral of VAT payments. So Qatar and Saudi have sort of taken a lead on that. Bahrain's doing a similar thing. It'd be good to, obviously the GCC VAT law applied across the board, so it'd be good to have one sort of common approach to COVID in terms of, as we said, ideally a VAT sort of abatement on the essential services like F&B would be great to see, but we haven't seen that yet.
Yeah, and as you said, is there any other specific help and support that should be developed for the hospitality sector? Are there particular areas where you're seeing people struggling that you think that's somewhere that we need to get something?
Yeah, it's going to be anything that can help, the cash flows, whether that's reducing the municipality fees, service fees, but they normally, there's a huge amount of additional fees that are put on top of your restaurant bill. It's going to be like 28% or something in the UAE, but obviously they only really get charged if you're in business. But a reduction on those, deferral on those, we defer on your VAT payments. There are ways of sort of reducing your VAT bills, which there's been some articles about. So, if you go through and look at your old debts, the debts that probably should have been written off in your books by now, if you clear those out, you can then get VAT credit on those from your next VAT bill. So that's one way of sort of looking at reducing your bill. I think another big one might be the manpower. So the hotels and restaurants with hundreds, if not thousands, of employees and a fixed cost, if they can be reallocated to some government initiatives and help some of the other industries that are busy in terms of, supermarket deliveries or helping, stitch masks for hospitals or something, which is John and Carol said has been it's been sort of anticipated in those resolutions, but I haven't seen the government say, yeah, we need 1,000 people to come and help with this, and we will pay, you know, a portion of their salaries to do so. I think, you know, that would be the next great step, which would really help.
A question here from Nikhil MERA, who asks, are there any clear grounds that allow a tenant to terminate a lease agreement mid-term without any penalty?
Only if you've expressly got one. So some leases, long-term leases, do have a break clause, and it gives you the right. And that's why you should always dig out all your tenancy agreements, leases, and just have a look and remind yourself, what is the term? Is it up for renewal? Is there a rent renewal, you know, option coming up, which may give you a right to terminate? That's going to be your only clear, easy way to exit without a penalty, you know, if your contract says so. Assuming that's not the case, you have to try and either negotiate with the landlord to exit, which is going to be tricky, or you're going to have to put together, like we said, a force majeure clause case. So trying to argue that you've got an event of force majeure, or there's another option under UA civil law for unforeseen circumstances. So there is, even if you haven't got a force majeure clause in your contract, your lease, you could say that if there's an unforeseen, you know, circumstance, it's having a major impact on your business, you're unable to pay your rent, there is an argument you can run for that as well. And we did see that a lot in the last sort of downturn, you know, the financial crisis. A lot of people did run that argument to sort of mixed effects. And, you know, you'd need a very good local litigator to help you run that argument. And you're going to have to take it to court, no doubt. And you're going to have to convince the judge that, you know, it falls within that case. So the basic answer is there's no clear grounds to exit without penalty. It's gonna be a journey and a challenge, let's say.
No easy task. We have a couple of questions from Wadi Farha, who's asked if are banks providing overdrafts with government support, and also can we partly pay gratuity after 1 month unpaid leave?
The banks, there is some schemes. So the central bank did issue, you know, they relaxed the requirements for banks. So the bank's internal lending policies, you know, how much capital, liquidity, all those, you know, complex things that most of us don't see that banks have to comply with in terms of their lending. They have relaxed those, which means they can, I think there was a scheme, targeted economic support scheme that they launched, with the idea of being able to give deferred payment terms and deferral of principal and interest payments to end users. So there is something. I don't know how much it's been taken up, but there was something from the central bank, yes.
And so I think the other question was partly pay.
John and Carol, I think, wasn't that?
Yeah. So the question was whether they could pay out part of the gratuity, is that right?
Yes, can we partly pay gratuity after 1 month unpaid leave?
There's nothing to prevent them from doing so. I mean, obviously, gratuity itself only kicks in reality at the point where, you know, the employment terminates. But provided you have got a very clear express written agreement identifying the amount, and also a confirmation from the employee that this will then obviously be set off against, that this is an advance payment against gratuity, then yes, you can do it, particularly in these circumstances. It would be if that's an option that could work for people. And funnily enough, we're looking at one of the things we've been looking at, in fact, before even the resolutions came out, were how pragmatic can we be about things in terms of easing the pain, shall we say, for employees further down the line, but also, of course, ultimately easing the pain for employers further down the line, particularly those employers who maybe haven't actually perhaps put their ESG into a proper fund in a separate account over the years, and are basically trying to fund ESG from their working capital, their gratuity rather, that's what I refer to ESG. Those who are actually trying to use it from working capital, then if you've got the funds now to make a payment out, it is something which is doable, subject to obviously having a very clear written agreement to that effect. I mean, Caron, I don't know if that's something you've come across yet as a suggestion from anybody.
Those employers who are putting their staff on either reduced or unpaid, or either stating they're freezing those entitlements and they will come back in full force. once the business reopens or the business has continuity, the key element, like John mentioned, is the affordability. If you don't have it in your working capital, you can't pay it. You either make a personal commitment to do so once you can and put that in writing, and mutually agree with your employee, but it's all about mutual agreement. If you've got to communicate, you've got to sit down, you've got to share this is what I can do now, this is what I can possibly do. But if the doors close, and any sale of asset, God forbid, people have to get to that point of selling the business, I can possibly, look after you in the long run. And, I'd like to say there were some miracle answers there again, but you've just got to...
It's never easy. We're at 11 o'clock now, but I'm going to try and be sneaky and throw in another question. Again, employment related, are you aware of any specific advance notice period employers must give employees on changing conditions of employment? This is from Andy Holman. He said, recognising that common practice would be a month's notice, is that obligatory under these circumstances?
Well, thanks to Andy for that question. I think we've got to look to the terms of Resolution 279 at the moment. Again, forgive me for having to sort of keep going back to that resolution, but it's been specifically put in place, obviously, for the purposes of dealing with this scenario. And the starting point within that is it identifies 5 different types of steps that might be taken. And all of them are, again, underpinned by consent. So it's not just simply a case of, from a labor law perspective specifically, it's not just simply a case of saying, we are going to do it from date X. We're giving you notice of that fact now. So there still has to be consent. It's the simple answer to it, irrespective. Particularly if you're looking at things such as permanent reduction. That one as well also needs that ministry approval, or as I mentioned with the MCC and DDA, it'll also need the authority's approval. Beyond that, I suppose being cynical about it, for many employers, or for many employees, I should say, it could be a case of, well, this is it, take it or leave it. So of course, if people aren't going to agree to it, then they know that the ultimate potential outcome could be termination of employment by reason of redundancy, which I think in these circumstances, again, some commentators and I disagree on this. I think given the circumstances would be regarded as a valid reason for dismissal. However, just to very quickly shove something else into this as well, from an arbitrary dismissal perspective, if there was an indication that the reason why you selected somebody particularly for dismissal in those circumstances was the fact that they didn't personally agree to a change in their terms and conditions, it's entirely possible that that would fall foul of the arbitrary dismissal provisions in the labour law, because it would seem that the actual decision was based more on the fact of indignation that somebody didn't agree to a change than substantively identifying them as the right person to let go in the circumstances.
Thanks for that, John. Now, so we are past time, but Damien Conway has asked to throw in a final light-hearted question for each of you. When will we be allowed to reopen? I thought it was
something easy. I thought it was something easy, like, with it being a light-hearted question, like, what's your favourite colour or something like that. When will it be able to reopen? Frankly, I think from the UAE perspective, it seems to have been getting on top of this situation far better than a lot of other countries have. So it's entirely possible that we, just my own personal view of it, so not with any particular legal head on here, my own reading of it is it's entirely possible that we might be up and running a bit sooner than some other countries. In terms of what it means, though, in a practical sense, what's your footfall going to be? Because if people aren't flying in from other countries, and particularly within our sector that we're talking about today, yes, there may be reopening, but it's probably going to be very gradual. And in terms of what that means for employees, that's a very uncertain future still.
Anyone else like to venture a suggestion?
And Damien asked for you can only answer with a date as well, he said, John. Just to make it even harder.
I was trying to keep it easy for you guys and give you a bit of leeway.
My total guess is we're looking at another 3 months, inshallah.
June the 14th.
Very specific, I like it. Caron, you're the last one up.
I'm going to actually, I would say around the middle of June also. I'm not going to say a specific date, but I'd go for middle of June at this moment in time.
Sitting on the fence there, Caron, I'm disappointed. No. But, thank you very much for taking part in this. I hope we managed to get through just about all of the questions. There's some fantastic response there from everyone. Thank you so much to the others. Jennifer's back to go. What I'll do is I'll hand you back over to Jennifer to finish up. But yeah, thank you so much to the panelists and to everyone watching on.
Well, thank
Pleasure.
you, Simon. I did a great job of moderating some really tough questions. And thank you so much to our panelists. I think from what I've seen coming through, I think everyone found that really useful. We will, as I mentioned, send you through some of the questions that might have gone unanswered to get your perspective on, if you don't mind. And we'll circulate that afterwards. Now, I know that some people had mentioned about having, coming together in terms of rents. And one of the things we are looking at doing is a survey that should go out next week with JLL to understand exactly the impact that this crisis has had on the restaurant community. So I would encourage you all to fill that out when it comes through so we can start to aggregate some information about what the true impact has been. Next week, we have a great session for you, which is going to be headed by Landlord Food Diva. And it's going to be an all-female panel, which I'm quite excited about. We've got Claudia De Brito, editor of Hotelier Middle East, Stasha, owner of 21 Gram, and Nikki Walsh, director of marketing communications for Saru Hospitality and Dubai Retail. And they will be tackling the question of, the topic of make or break your restaurant with effective communications during the crisis. So I think each session we'll be sending around a follow-up and recording of this session and the link to sign up for next week. Also, if you haven't already, please do fill out our survey, which is looking at how, as MERA, we can better serve you guys and what you're looking for. As we start to bring together this restaurant community and start placing the foundations for MERA, please do be patient with us. We're moving as quickly as we can, and we'll be in touch in the coming weeks with further information. So thank you all for joining us. Really appreciate it, and have a great day.